The dust spiraled upward in tiny tornadoes as Delilah Garner clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her heart pounding against her ribs like a frightened bird. The shop owner's meaty hand clamped around her thin wrist, the half loaf of bread she'd tucked beneath her tattered coat now exposed for all of Black Hawk, Colorado to see. "Thief!" Mr. Holloway shouted, his face reddening with rage as he dragged her toward the center of the town's main street. "We've got ourselves a thief here." It was 1878, and Black Hawk had changed from a simple mining camp to a proper town in the years following the gold rush. Delilah hadn't meant to steal, she truly hadn't, but her 4-year-old son Timothy hadn't eaten in nearly 2 days. And the desperation that comes from a child's hungry cries had driven her to an act she'd never considered before. "Please," she begged, her voice barely audible over the gathering crowd's murmurs. "My son, he's hungry. I'll work it off, I swear." Holloway sneered, tightening his grip. "Sheriff Mendez deals with thieves, not me. You know what the punishment is." Indeed, she did. In these parts, theft could mean jail time or worse, public humiliation in the stocks that still stood as a relic of frontier justice outside the jailhouse. For a woman alone with a child, even a day in the stocks could mean Timothy would be taken from her. What's going on here? A deep voice cut through the commotion, silencing the onlookers. The crowd parted, and a tall figure stepped forward. Delilah looked up through tear-blurred eyes to see a man unlike most in Black Hawk. He wasn't dressed in miner's clothes or a businessman's suit, but rather the practical attire of a cattleman, a worn leather vest over a simple shirt, sturdy pants tucked into boots that had seen many miles. A wide-brimmed hat shaded eyes that assessed the situation with calm intensity. "Caught this one stealing bread," Holloway declared triumphantly. "Taking food right off decent folks' tables." The stranger's gaze fell on Delilah, taking in her threadbare dress, the hollowness in her cheeks, the desperation in her eyes. He seemed to understand everything in that single look. "How much for the bread?" he asked, his voice level. Holloway blinked in surprise. "It ain't about the bread, it's the principle. I asked how much," the stranger repeated, reaching into his pocket. 25 cents, Holloway said, then added spitefully, "plus another $1 for the trouble." Without hesitation, the man produced the coins and placed them firmly in Holloway's palm, forcing him to release Delilah's wrist. "That covers it, I believe," the stranger said, "and the lady will be taking that bread with her." Holloway sputtered but pocketed the money. The crowd began to disperse, disappointed at being denied their spectacle of justice. Delilah stood frozen, cradling her wrist where angry red marks were forming. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes downcast. "I don't know how I'll repay you." "No need," he replied, then hesitated before adding, "Name's Blake Zimmerman. I've got a ranch just outside town." "Delilah Garner," she replied automatically. "And I do need to repay you. I'm not a charity case, Mr. Zimmerman." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Never thought you were, madam." His eyes traveled to the bread still clutched in her hands. "Seems like that won't last long." Delilah stiffened. "It's not for me." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Your child," she nodded once, pride battling with shame across her features. Blake glanced around the street, aware they were still the subject of curious stares. "Mrs. Garner, miss," she corrected quietly. Something shifted in his expression. "Miss Garner, I've got a proposition for you, but this isn't the place. Would you allow me to walk you home?" Suspicion flared in Delilah's eyes. She'd heard propositions before from men who thought a desperate woman would do anything. "I don't think. It's not what you're thinking," Blake said quickly, reading her expression. "It's a legitimate offer, one that might help both of us." Delilah hesitated, then nodded. "This way," she said, leading him toward the edge of town where a small, dilapidated cabin stood apart from the more established homes. As they walked, Blake kept a respectful distance. "How long have you been in Black Hawk?" "6 months," she answered. "Came from Denver after." She trailed off, unwilling to share the painful details of her past with a stranger. After things got difficult, Blake finished for her, not pressing for more. They reached the cabin and Delilah paused outside. "Timothy, my son, he's inside with our neighbor, Mrs. Foster. She watches him when I look for work." Blake nodded. "I'd like to meet him if that's all right." Delilah pushed open the door to reveal a sparse but clean interior. An elderly woman sat in a rocking chair by the small fireplace, and beside her on a threadbare rug sat a small boy with curly hair the same auburn shade as Delilah's. He looked up as they entered, his eyes widening at the sight of a stranger. "Mama!" he cried, running to Delilah. She scooped him up, holding him close. "I brought bread, Timmy," she said softly, showing him her prize. Mrs. Foster rose with a grunt. "Who's this, then?" she asked, eyeing Blake suspiciously. "Blake Zimmerman, madam," he said, removing his hat. "I own the Double Z Ranch outside town." Recognition dawned on Mrs. Foster's weathered face. "Zimmerman, heard you bought the old Peterson place last spring." "That's right," Blake confirmed, still getting it in proper order. Mrs. Foster gathered her shawl. "Well, I'll be going then. Timothy was good as gold today, Delilah." After the older woman left, Delilah cut a thin slice of bread for Timothy, who devoured it hungrily. She sat him at their small table with the promise of more after their visitor had stated his business. "What's this proposition, Mr. Zimmerman?" she asked, directly once Timothy was occupied. Blake cleared his throat, suddenly looking uncomfortable. "Miss Garner, I've got a ranch that's growing. I need help running the household, cooking, cleaning, mending. I can offer you and your boy a place to stay, meals, and fair wages." Hope flickered briefly in Delilah's eyes before suspicion returned. "Why me? You don't know anything about me." "I know you'd steal to feed your child but look guilty doing it," he said quietly. "That tells me enough about your character." Delilah's expression softened slightly. "I appreciate the offer, but there's more," Blake interrupted, his voice low enough that Timothy couldn't hear. "This town has a long memory, Miss Garner. What happened today won't be forgotten. People will talk, and work that might have come your way won't now." The truth of his words stung. Delilah had already found it difficult to secure decent employment as a single mother with no husband to speak for her character. "Besides," Blake continued, that is, the ranch would benefit from a woman's touch. And he paused, seeming to gather his courage. "If you were to come as my wife, no one would question your place there." Delilah's breath caught. "Your wife, in name only," he hastened to add. "It would be an arrangement, not a real marriage. You'd have your own room, of course, but it would give you and Timothy a home, respectability. No one would dare call you a thief as Mrs. Zimmerman." Delilah stared at him in disbelief. "You're offering to marry me, a woman you just met, because I stole a loaf of bread?" Blake shifted uncomfortably. "When you put it that way, it does sound foolish. But I've been alone on that ranch for a year now. The previous owner's housekeeper left when I bought the place. I need help, and you need a fresh start. It would be a business arrangement, nothing more." "And if I refuse?" His expression remained neutral. "Then I wish you well, Miss Garner. The offer stands either way. If you'd prefer to simply work as my housekeeper, that can be arranged too. But I thought the protection of my name might serve you better." Delilah looked at Timothy, who had finished his bread and was now watching them with curious eyes. What kind of future could she give him here, now that she'd been branded a thief? Even if she found work, the wages would barely cover food and this leaking cabin. Winter would come again, and last year they'd nearly frozen. "I need time to think," she said finally. Blake nodded, placing his hat back on his head. "I'll be in town until tomorrow afternoon. I'm staying at the boarding house." He moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, Miss Garner, I believe we could help each other. I'm not looking to take advantage of your situation." After he left, Delilah sat beside Timothy, pulling him into her lap. "What do you think of Mr. Zimmerman?" she asked softly. "He's big," Timothy observed with a child's simplicity. "Is he going to help us, Mama?" Delilah stroked his curls, her mind racing through possibilities and dangers. "Maybe, my love, maybe." That night, after Timothy fell asleep, Delilah sat by the window staring at the stars. Mrs. Foster had come by earlier, and Delilah had confided Blake's proposal. "Marry him," the old woman had said bluntly. "Zimmerman's got a good reputation. Quiet man, keeps to himself, but fair with his workers. That ranch of his is growing, could be something real substantial in a few years." "But I don't know him," Delilah had protested. Mrs. Foster had fixed her with a knowing look. "Girl, you think most marriages out here start with love. They start with need. Love either comes or it doesn't, but a roof and food for that boy of yours is worth more than romantic notions." Now, as midnight approached, Delilah made her decision. The next morning, she packed their meager belongings into a single worn carpetbag and took Timothy by the hand. They walked to the boarding house, where they found Blake just finishing his breakfast. His eyes registered surprise when he saw them, then understanding. "You've decided?" he asked simply. Delilah nodded. "Yes. For Timothy's sake, I accept your offer." Blake stood. "Both parts of it, both parts," she confirmed quietly, "though I have conditions." A small smile touched his lips. "I expected nothing less. Name them." "Timothy comes first: his welfare, his education. I want your word that you'll treat him well." "You have it," Blake said without hesitation. "And this arrangement," she continued, forcing herself to meet his eyes, "it remains as you described until we decide otherwise together. I won't be forced into wifely duties I haven't agreed to." Blake's face flushed slightly, but he nodded. "I gave my word it would be a marriage in name only, and I stand by that. Anything more would only happen if both of us wanted it." Delilah took a deep breath. "Then I agree to become Mrs. Zimmerman." They were married that same day by the town's justice of the peace, with only Mrs. Foster and a ranch hand named Pedro as witnesses. Timothy stood beside his mother, confused by the proceedings but excited about the prospect of living on a real ranch with horses. As they exchanged simple vows, Delilah searched Blake's face for any sign of regret or deception. She found only steady resolve and perhaps a hint of relief. When he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, produced unexpectedly from his pocket, she wondered how long he had carried it, and for whom it had originally been intended. "It was my mother's," he explained quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "It seemed right you should have it, to make this look proper." The ride to the Double Z Ranch took nearly 2 hours, with Timothy perched in front of Blake on his sturdy gelding while Delilah rode a gentle mare Blake had brought for her. As they crested the final hill, Delilah caught her first glimpse of her new home. The main house was larger than she expected, a 2-story structure built of solid timber with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Several outbuildings dotted the property, including a barn, bunkhouse, and what appeared to be a smokehouse. In the distance, she could see cattle grazing on rolling grassland that stretched toward mountains on the horizon. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Blake glanced at her, a hint of pride in his expression. "It will be. There's work to be done, but the bones are good." They dismounted near the house, and Blake helped Timothy down. A young Mexican man came running from the barn to take the horses. "Diego, meet Mrs. Zimmerman and her son Timothy," Blake said. "They'll be living here now." Diego's eyes widened briefly before he recovered with a respectful nod. "Welcome, Senora. Bienvenido, Pequeño." As Blake led them into the house, Delilah could sense the ripple of surprise their arrival was causing among the ranch hands who caught glimpses of them from various workstations. Clearly, Blake hadn't mentioned he was returning with a wife and child. The interior of the house was spacious but Spartan, with good furniture covered in a layer of dust. The kitchen was large and well-equipped but showed signs of bachelor neglect. "I cook for myself most nights," Blake explained as they toured the ground floor. "The men eat at the bunkhouse. Pedro's wife, Lucia, cooks for them." Upstairs, he showed them to a large bedroom. "This will be yours and Timothy's," he said, opening the door to reveal a 4-poster bed and a smaller trundle that could be pulled out. "My room is across the hall." Delilah nodded, feeling both relief and a strange twinge of disappointment that he so readily confirmed they would not share quarters. "I'll leave you to get settled," Blake said. "Dinner is usually at 6. I need to check on a new calf that was born yesterday." When he was gone, Timothy ran to the window. "Mama, look at the horses," he exclaimed, pointing to the corral where several horses milled about. "I see them, sweetheart," she said, joining him. "Do you think you'll like living here?" Timothy nodded enthusiastically. "Mr. Blake said I can learn to ride a pony." Delilah smiled, though her heart twisted at how quickly her son had attached Mr. to Blake's name, as if trying to figure out what to call this man who was suddenly part of their lives. Later, after unpacking their few belongings, Delilah ventured downstairs to assess the kitchen. She found a well-stocked pantry far better than she expected and began planning dinner. By the time Blake returned, she had a stew simmering, biscuits baking, and had managed to find the ingredients for a simple apple cobbler. The surprise on his face when he entered the kitchen made her smile despite her nervousness. "Something smells amazing," he said, removing his hat. He'd clearly washed up, his dark hair damp and his face clean of the dust that had covered him earlier. "I hope you like beef stew," Delilah said. "I found a good piece of chuck in the cold box." "I'd eat shoe leather if it smelled that good," he admitted with a small smile. Timothy appeared from the sitting room where he'd been exploring. "Mr. Blake, I found a checker set." Blake's smile widened. Do you know how to play?" When Timothy shook his head, Blake sat at the kitchen table. "Let me show you while your mama finishes cooking." Delilah watched them from the corner of her eye as she finished dinner preparations. Blake was patient with Timothy, explaining the rules of checkers clearly and letting the boy win their first game. There was a gentleness to him she hadn't expected from a man of his size and obvious strength. That night, after putting Timothy to bed in their new room, Delilah found Blake on the front porch, smoking a pipe and staring at the stars. "He's asleep," she said, wrapping her shawl tighter against the evening chill. Blake nodded. "He's a good boy. Quick, too. He almost beat me fair and square on our third game." Delilah smiled. "He's always been bright." She hesitated, then asked the question that had been on her mind all day. "Your ranch hands, what did you tell them about me, about us?" Blake tapped his pipe against the porch railing. "The truth, more or less, that I met you in town, that you needed help, and that I offered marriage as a solution." He glanced at her. "I left out the part about the bread. That's no one's business but ours." "Thank you for that," she said softly. They stood in companionable silence for a moment before Blake spoke again. "I know this isn't what you wanted for yourself, Delilah, but I hope in time you'll come to feel this is your home." The use of her given name startled her. He'd been careful to call her Miss Garner or Mrs. Zimmerman until now. Something about the way he said it, with a slight softening of his usually firm voice, sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "I hope so too," she replied, and was surprised to find she meant it. The days turned into weeks as Delilah settled into life at the Double Z. The house gradually transformed under her care, becoming cleaner, more organized, and infinitely more comfortable. Blake often came in from a day's work to find new curtains hanging, or furniture rearranged to better advantage, or some small touch that made the house feel more like a home. Timothy thrived in the open spaces of the ranch. True to his word, Blake began teaching him to ride on a gentle pony named Sugar. The boy's laughter as he bounced around the corral on his first solo ride brought tears to Delilah's eyes, tears of joy, mingled with a bittersweet awareness that her son was already forming an attachment to this man, who was her husband in name only. For his part, Blake proved to be exactly as he'd promised, respectful of their arrangement, never crossing the boundaries they'd established. He was unfailingly kind to Timothy, patient with the boy's endless questions about ranch life, and attentive to Delilah's needs without being intrusive. But there were moments, fleeting instances, when their hands would touch as she passed him a plate at dinner, or when their eyes met across the room that made Delilah wonder what it might be like if theirs were a real marriage. She would quickly banish such thoughts, reminding herself that gratitude was not the same as love, and that Blake had made no indication he wanted anything more than their current arrangement. One evening in late August, nearly 2 months after they'd arrived at the Double Z, a sudden summer storm blew in while Blake was still out checking the north pasture. As lightning split the darkening sky and thunder rolled across the valley, Delilah paced the porch, scanning the horizon for any sign of him. "Shouldn't you come inside, Mama?" Timothy asked from the doorway, his eyes wide with concern. "Soon, sweetheart," she assured him. "I just want to make sure Mr. Blake gets back safely." Rain began to fall in heavy sheets, and Delilah was about to retreat inside when she spotted a figure on horseback, galloping toward the house. Relief washed over her as Blake rode into the yard, dismounted quickly, and led his horse to the barn. Without thinking, she grabbed a towel and ran through the rain to meet him as he emerged from the barn several minutes later. "You're soaked through," she scolded, holding out the towel. Blake took it with a surprised smile. "It's just water." "It's a cold rain," she countered, "and you've been working since dawn. The last thing we need is for you to catch pneumonia." Something in his expression shifted at her concern. Delilah felt heat rise to her cheeks despite the cool rain still falling around them. "The ranch," she clarified hastily. "The ranch needs you healthy." Blake's smile deepened as he draped the towel around his neck. "Of course, the ranch." They walked back to the house together, and Delilah insisted he change into dry clothes while she prepared hot coffee. When he came back downstairs, Timothy immediately demanded to know if the cattle were safe from the storm. "They're fine," Blake assured him, ruffling the boy's hair. "Cattle have been weathering storms since long before we came along to worry about them." After dinner, as the storm continued to rage outside, Blake surprised them by producing a book from his study. "My mother used to read to me on nights like this," he explained, settling into his armchair by the fire. "Would you like me to read to you, Timothy?" The boy nodded eagerly, climbing onto the arm of Blake's chair without hesitation. Delilah sat on the sofa across from them, her mending in her lap forgotten as Blake's deep voice filled the room, bringing to life the adventures of Robinson Crusoe. As the evening wore on, Timothy's eyelids grew heavy, and he eventually fell asleep leaning against Blake's shoulder. When Blake carefully gathered the boy in his arms to carry him upstairs, Delilah felt something inside her shift, as if a piece of her heart that had been carefully guarded was suddenly exposed. Later, after Timothy was tucked in bed, Delilah found Blake back in the sitting room staring into the fire. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the story. He loved it." Blake looked up, his face softened by the firelight. I enjoyed it too. It's been a long time since I read those old tales. Delilah hesitated, then took a seat in the chair Timothy had vacated. May I ask you something personal? You may ask. I might not answer, he replied with a small smile. Why haven't you married before now? Really married, I mean. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He was silent for so long that Delilah began to regret asking. I was engaged once, he finally said, his voice low. 6 years ago, before I came to Colorado. Her name was Catherine. Delilah remained silent, sensing there was more to the story. She died, Blake continued. Influenza. 3 weeks before our wedding day. I'm so sorry, Delilah whispered. Blake shrugged, though the casual gesture couldn't mask the old pain in his eyes. After that, I left Virginia, headed west. Tried to outrun memories, I suppose. Worked cattle drives, saved my money, eventually had enough to buy this place. He looked around the room. Never thought much about marrying again. Seemed easier to be alone. And now, Delilah asked before she could stop herself. Do you regret our arrangement? Blake met her eyes directly. No, he said firmly. I don't regret it, do you? Delilah shook her head. No, Timothy is happier than I've ever seen him, and she paused, searching for the right words. I feel safe here. Something flickered in Blake's eyes. You weren't safe before. The question opened a door Delilah had kept firmly closed. She stared at her hands, twisting her wedding ring. Timothy's father, she began hesitantly. He wasn't a good man. When I told him I was with child, he disappeared. Left Denver entirely from what I heard. Blake's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, letting her continue. After Timothy was born, I worked as a seamstress, then as a laundress when that didn't pay enough. We got by, barely. She swallowed hard. Then last winter, a client at the laundry began to pay special attention to me. Bringing small gifts for Timothy, offering to help. I was naive enough to believe he was simply kind. Understanding darkened Blake's expression. He wanted more than you were willing to give, Delilah nodded. When I refused him, he became unpleasant. Threatened to tell people I'd been improper with him, that I was no better than I should be. He had influence in town. No one would have believed my word over his. She took a shaky breath. So we left, came to Black Hawk to start over. And then you had to steal bread, Blake finished quietly. Yes, Delilah looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. So you see, when you ask if I regret our arrangement, how could I? You saved us. Blake rose from his chair and knelt before her, taking her hands in his. His touch was warm, strong, and for the first time, Delilah didn't feel the need to pull away. You saved yourself, he said firmly. You kept your boy alive, kept moving forward. All I did was offer a hand when you needed it. The tenderness in his voice undid her. A tear slipped down her cheek, and before she could brush it away, Blake's thumb gently caught it. The simple gesture of comfort broke something open inside her, and suddenly she was crying in earnest, not the silent tears she'd taught herself to shed when Timothy was asleep, but deep, racking sobs that came from years of fear and struggle. Without a word, Blake gathered her into his arms, holding her against his chest as she cried. He didn't offer empty reassurances or tell her to hush. He simply held her, one hand moving in slow circles on her back until the storm of emotion passed. When she finally quieted, Delilah became acutely aware of their position, of the solid warmth of his chest beneath her cheek, of the steady beat of his heart, of the clean scent of soap and pine that clung to his shirt. Embarrassment flooded her, and she pulled back. I'm sorry, she whispered, wiping her face. I don't know what came over me. Blake's hands remained on her arms, steadying her. Never apologize for honest feelings, Delilah. The way he said her name like it was something precious made her heart skip. She met his gaze and found something there that frightened and thrilled her in equal measure. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, and more surprising still, she realized she wanted him to. But Blake released her gently and stood. "It's late," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "We should both get some rest." Delilah nodded, both relieved and disappointed. As she rose to go upstairs, Blake called her name once more. "Delilah," she turned. "Yes, thank you for trusting me with your story." She smiled softly. "Thank you for listening." That night, lying in her bed with Timothy sleeping peacefully beside her, Delilah stared at the ceiling and admitted to herself what she'd been trying to deny for weeks. She was falling in love with her husband. The realization both exhilarated and terrified her. What if Blake never felt the same? What if he only ever saw her as a responsibility he'd taken on, a woman he'd rescued from disgrace? Could she bear to live as his wife in name only while harboring deeper feelings for him? September brought cooler temperatures and the beginning of preparations for winter. Blake and his men worked from dawn until dusk, repairing fences, bringing in the last hay, and culling the herd to ensure only the strongest cattle would need feeding through the cold months. Delilah threw herself into her own preparations, canning vegetables from the kitchen garden, making preserves from the wild berries Timothy had helped gather, smoking meat, and ensuring the house was sealed against drafts. Through it all, she tried to maintain a careful distance from Blake, afraid that her feelings might show too clearly if she allowed herself to be alone with him. If Blake noticed her newfound reserve, he didn't comment on it. He continued to be unfailingly kind and respectful, though Delilah occasionally caught him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. One crisp morning in late September, Blake announced at breakfast that he needed to ride into town for supplies. "Would you and Timothy like to come along?" he asked. "It might be our last chance before the weather turns." Timothy immediately began pleading to go, and Delilah couldn't refuse the excitement in her son's eyes or the opportunity to shop for winter fabric and perhaps some small luxuries. The ride to Black Hawk was pleasant, with Timothy chattering happily from his perch in front of Blake on the gelding. Delilah rode alongside them on the mare she'd come to think of as her own, enjoying the brilliant autumn colors that painted the landscape. As they approached town, Delilah felt a flutter of anxiety. This would be her first time back since the day of her disgrace and hasty marriage. How would people react to seeing her as Mrs. Zimmerman? Blake seemed to sense her unease. "Stay close," he said quietly. "You have nothing to be ashamed of." They tied their horses at the hitching post outside the general store. Blake helped Timothy down, then offered his hand to Delilah. As they stepped onto the boardwalk, Delilah felt the weight of curious stares. She lifted her chin and placed her hand on Blake's arm, drawing strength from his solid presence. Inside the store, Mr. Holloway's eyes widened at the sight of them. "Mr. Zimmerman," he said, his gaze darting between Blake and Delilah. "Good to see you." "Holloway," Blake replied with a curt nod. "My wife has a list of items we'll need." The shopkeeper's eyebrows shot up at the word wife, but he quickly composed his features. "Of course. How can I help you, Mrs. Zimmerman?" The hesitation before her married name was slight but unmistakable. Delilah smiled pleasantly and handed over her carefully prepared list. "We'll need everything on here, plus whatever fabric you have suitable for winter clothes for a growing boy." As Holloway began gathering their supplies, the bell over the door jingled and a well-dressed woman entered, followed by two others. Delilah recognized them as the wives of Black Hawk's more prominent citizens. "Mr. Zimmerman," the first woman said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What a surprise to see you in town." "Mrs. Porter," Blake replied politely. "Ladies." Mrs. Porter's gaze slid to Delilah, cool assessment in her expression. "And this is—" "My wife, Delilah," Blake said, his tone leaving no room for the doubt Mrs. Porter clearly hoped to sow. "Delilah, this is Mrs. Porter, Mrs. Wilkins, and Mrs. Abernathy." Delilah inclined her head. "Pleased to meet you, ladies." Mrs. Porter's smile tightened. "Indeed, how interesting. We hadn't heard that you had married Mr. Zimmerman." "Hadn't you?" Blake replied mildly. "Strange, considering how quickly news typically travels in Black Hawk." Before Mrs. Porter could respond, Timothy reappeared from where he'd been examining a display of candy sticks. "Mama, can I have one, please, Mrs.?" Porter's eyes widened at the word "mama," and her companions exchanged meaningful glances. Blake placed a hand on Timothy's shoulder. "I think you deserve a treat for being such a good rider today. What do you say, Delilah?" Delilah nodded, acutely aware of the women's scrutiny. "Yes, you may have one, Timothy." As the boy happily selected a peppermint stick, Mrs. Porter leaned closer to Delilah. "How fortunate for you," she murmured, her voice pitched low enough that only Delilah could hear, "to have found a man willing to overlook your circumstances." Heat rushed to Delilah's cheeks, but before she could respond, Blake was at her side, his arm slipping protectively around her waist. "We should finish our shopping, darling," he said, the endearment rolling off his tongue as if he'd been using it for years. "We promised Timothy we'd let him choose a new book before we head home." The possessive way he held her, the warmth in his voice when he called her darling, it was all for show, Delilah knew, yet her heart raced as if it were real. "Yes, of course," she replied, leaning into his embrace with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. Mrs. Porter's smile had frozen in place. "Well, don't let us keep you. Perhaps you'll join us for tea sometime, Mrs. Zimmerman. I'm sure we'd all love to hear how you and Mr. Zimmerman met." "Perhaps," Delilah replied noncommittally. "Good day, ladies." Outside the store, Delilah released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you," she said quietly. Blake's arm was still around her waist. "For what?" "For defending me. For making it clear that I'm truly your wife, not just someone you took pity on." Blake's expression grew serious. "Is that what you think? That I married you out of pity?" Delilah looked away. "Wasn't it?" His hand moved to her chin, gently turning her face back to his. "No," he said firmly. "It wasn't pity, Delilah." The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "Then what was it?" Before he could answer, Timothy came bounding up to them, proudly displaying his peppermint stick. The moment was lost as Blake turned his attention to the boy. But Delilah couldn't forget the look in his eyes, or the feeling that something important had almost been revealed. They completed their shopping, had a simple meal at the hotel restaurant, and were preparing to leave town when a commotion further down the street caught their attention. A crowd had gathered, and angry voices could be heard. "Stay here," Blake instructed, helping Timothy onto the mare with Delilah. "I'll see what's happening." He returned a few minutes later, his expression grim. "Stage was robbed about 5 miles outside town. Driver was shot, but he'll live. Passengers are shaken up but unhurt." "How terrible," Delilah said. "Do they know who did it?" Blake nodded. "The Delaney brothers, most likely. They've been causing trouble up and down the territory for months." He glanced at the setting sun. "We should head back. I don't want to be on the road after dark, not with those outlaws about." They rode home more quickly than they had come, with Blake constantly scanning the horizon. The tension in his shoulders didn't ease until the ranch house came into view, golden in the last light of day. That night, after Timothy was asleep, Delilah found Blake in his study, cleaning his rifle with methodical care. "You think those men, the ones who robbed the stage, might come this way?" she asked from the doorway. Blake looked up. "It's unlikely." They usually head north after a job toward Wyoming territory, but I believe in being prepared. Delilah entered the room and sat across from him. The way you protected me today in town. Thank you. Blake set aside the rifle. Those women had no right to judge you. If anyone in that town knew what you've overcome, they'd be ashamed of themselves. His defense of her warmed Delilah more than she could express. For so long, she'd faced the world alone, shouldering judgment and hardship without anyone to stand beside her. Blake, she said softly, using his given name for the first time. What were you going to say? Before Timothy interrupted us. Blake's eyes met hers, and in them she saw conflict, desire, and something deeper that made her heart race. I was going to say, he began carefully, that when I offered marriage it wasn't out of pity. It was because I saw something in you, strength, courage, devotion to your son that I admired. I thought we could help each other, yes, but it was never charity. Delilah nodded slowly. And now? After these months together, Blake stood and moved to the window, his back to her. Now I find myself wishing our arrangement was different. The admission hung in the air between them, fraught with meaning. Delilah rose and crossed the room to stand behind him. How would you want it to be different? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Blake turned, and the naked longing in his expression took her breath away. I think you know. Delilah took a step closer. Tell me anyway. His hands came up to frame her face, gentle despite their strength. I want a real marriage, Delilah, not just in name. I want to fall asleep beside you at night and wake with you in the morning. I want to help raise Timothy as my own son. I want, he broke off, searching her face. I'm falling in love with you. I think I started falling the moment I saw you in that street, defiant even in your desperation. Joy bloomed in Delilah's chest, so intense it was almost painful. I thought it was just me, she whispered. I've been afraid to hope that you might feel the same. You feel the same. Blake's voice was rough with emotion. In answer, Delilah rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than a declaration. But when Blake's arms came around her, pulling her closer, the kiss deepened into something hungry and certain. When they finally parted, both breathless, Blake rested his forehead against hers. Are you sure, Delilah? I promised you wouldn't have to, I'm sure, she interrupted. I want a real marriage too, Blake. I want us to be a family, you, me, and Timothy. Blake kissed her again, this time with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. Then that's what we'll have, he promised. That night, for the first time, Delilah slept in Blake's bed, held securely in his arms. They didn't rush to consummate their newfound feelings, both agreeing that such a step should come when they were ready, but the simple act of lying together, of whispered confidences in the darkness, felt more intimate than anything Delilah had ever experienced. In the morning, Timothy was surprised to find his mother emerging from Blake's room, but accepted their explanation that they had decided to be a real family with the easy adaptability of childhood. Does that mean I can call you Pa now? He asked Blake over breakfast. Blake's eyes shone with emotion as he nodded. I'd be honored, Timothy. The transition from their arranged marriage to a loving one happened so naturally that Delilah sometimes wondered how she could ever have imagined living any other way. Blake proved to be a tender, considerate lover when they finally shared that aspect of marriage, and an attentive, patient father to Timothy. As winter settled over the Colorado mountains, the Double Z Ranch became truly a home. On snowy evenings, they would gather by the fire, Blake reading aloud, Timothy building elaborate structures with the wooden blocks Blake had carved for him, Delilah working on a quilt made from scraps of fabric she'd collected over the months. In late November, as the first heavy snow blanketed the valley, Delilah confirmed what she had begun to suspect. She was carrying Blake's child. When she told him, his face lit with such joy that she laughed through her happy tears. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her in a circle before setting her down carefully. "Are you happy?" he asked, suddenly uncertain. "Is it too soon?" Delilah placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "It's perfect," she assured him. "Our family is growing just as it should." They told Timothy that night, explaining that he would be a big brother come summer. His excitement knew no bounds as he immediately began listing all the things he would teach the baby. In the depths of winter, when the ranch was isolated by deep snow, news reached them by way of a traveling peddler that the Delaney brothers had been captured after attempting to rob a bank in Denver. The territory was safer with those outlaws behind bars, and Delilah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The fear that had lingered since that day in town that violence might find its way to their peaceful home finally eased. As spring thawed the land, new life appeared everywhere: calves in the pastures, wildflowers on the hillsides, and the gentle swell of Delilah's belly. Blake was protective to the point of fussing, insisting she rest frequently and hiring a young woman from town to help with the heavier household tasks. Timothy, now 5, began learning his letters and numbers under Delilah's guidance. Blake built him a small desk that sat by the window in the sitting room, where the boy would practice his writing while watching the activities of the ranch. One evening, in early May, as Delilah sat on the porch swing Blake had hung for her, her husband joined her with 2 glasses of lemonade. "Do you ever think about that day?" he asked as he settled beside her. "The day we met," Delilah smiled, accepting the cool drink. "Of course I do. How could I not? It changed everything." Blake took her free hand in his thumb brushing over her wedding ring. "If you hadn't needed that bread, if you hadn't been in town that day," she continued, "if I hadn't seen something special in a desperate woman with fire in her eyes." Delilah leaned against his shoulder. "We might never have found each other." Blake kissed the top of her head. "I thank God every day that we did." As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Delilah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the darkest moment of her life, being caught stealing bread for her starving child, had come the greatest blessing she could have imagined: a loving husband, a safe home, and the promise of a growing family. "What are you thinking?" Blake asked, his arm warm around her shoulders. Delilah smiled up at him, her heart full. "I'm thinking that sometimes when things seem most hopeless, life has a way of offering second chances. You were mine, Blake Zimmerman." He kissed her softly, his hand resting on the curve of her belly where their child grew. "And you were mine, Delilah Zimmerman. You and Timothy gave me back the family I thought I'd never have." As darkness fell and stars appeared in the vast Colorado sky, they remained on the porch, the gentle creak of the swing marking the peaceful rhythm of their shared life. From inside the house came the sound of Timothy's laughter as Diego's wife, Maria, taught him Spanish words for the animals on the ranch. In July, as wildflowers carpeted the meadows surrounding the Double Z, Delilah gave birth to a healthy baby boy they named James, after Blake's father. Timothy appointed himself official protector of his little brother, proudly helping Delilah whenever she would allow it. The years that followed brought both joys and challenges. The ranch prospered under Blake's careful management, eventually becoming one of the largest cattle operations in the county. 2 years after James's birth, Delilah delivered twin girls Elizabeth and Sarah, who grew into spirited young ladies with their mother's auburn hair and their father's steady determination. Timothy, raised with Blake's patient guidance and Delilah's loving care, developed into a thoughtful, capable young man who eventually took on more responsibility at the ranch. showing a natural talent for working with horses that surpassed even Blake's skill. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Blake surprised Delilah with a small gold locket containing miniature portraits of all 4 children. As he fastened it around her neck, he whispered, "Best investment I ever made, 1 loaf of bread and $1 for trouble." Delilah laughed and turned in his arms. "You got more than you bargained for, Mr. Zimmerman." "No," he said seriously, his eyes reflecting the same love they had shown her for a decade. "I got exactly what I needed, even when I didn't know I was looking for it." In the years that followed, whenever new settlers arrived in the area or travelers passed through, they would often comment on the obvious affection between the distinguished rancher and his beautiful wife. Few ever knew the unusual beginning of their union, how a desperate act of theft had led to a marriage that began as an arrangement of convenience and grew into one of the great love stories of Black Hawk, Colorado. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the work of the day was done, Blake and Delilah would often sit together on that same porch swing, watching the stars and marveling at how fate, compassion, and courage had woven their separate lives into one shared journey, a journey that had begun with a stolen loaf of bread and a stranger's unexpected kindness.